Welcome to our podcast session on the fascinating case of hybrid democracy in Cambodia, where we dive into how local decision-making discourses have reshaped what many consider liberal democracy. Let's get into it.
Right. Absolutely. It's really intriguing how the imposed notions of democracy from the UN in 1993 have been reinterpreted by Cambodian society.
So, at the heart of it, the idea is that democracy isn't just this universal, one-size-fits-all framework. Rather, it's deeply molded by local cultures and historical experiences.
Indeed.
The article really underscores that point, highlighting that local discourses of decision-making, like patron-client relations and even traditional village structures, play a central role in transforming the liberal democratic model into something uniquely Cambodian.
And, that's the fascinating part. How these locally embedded practices, which might seem at odds with Western ideologies, actually give birth to a hybrid form of governance.
Exactly. It's like, the UN introduced a sort of liberal democracy with elections and voter registration. But the people of Cambodia, with their own history, especially marked by violent pasts and traditional norms, ended up redefining what democracy means to them.
Yeah, I get that. Can we say it's a blend of historical legacies, such as the Khmer Rouge era and even earlier political structures, with contemporary ideas?
Spot on. The text points out that democracy has always come loaded with layers. Old meanings don't just vanish. You have this interpretative struggle where, for example, the word democracy might bring in memories of the past, like the Khmer Rouge era. And yet, after 1993, there was a shift when the UN pushed for a liberal model. It's like, the Cambodians are continuously reloading the meaning of democracy with each generation.
Absolutely. And that reloading, those evolving layers, are key to understanding how something as abstract as political participation or freedom becomes, something very tangible in the local context.
Right. And what's particularly striking is how the article critiques the so-called transition paradigm. The traditional models assumed that once you introduce free and fair elections, democracy will just sort itself out. But then, local conditions, like ethnic makeup, cultural traditions, and those ingrained systems of patron-client relations, throw a wrench in that neat transition.
So essentially, the transition paradigm neglects the local agency, the lived experiences, and the very distinct cultures that are actually negotiating with these imposed frameworks.
Exactly. And in Cambodia's case, those negotiations led to what the author calls hybrid democracy. It's like the imported liberal democracy gets mixed up with local ways of thinking, creating a unique political landscape that doesn't fully align with either Western liberal ideas or traditional practices.
Right. I also found it interesting how the concept of hybridity is discussed using ideas from post-colonial theorists like Homi Bhabha and Iris Young, where hybridity isn't just about mixing elements superficially, but actually about the dynamic process of change.
Yep. It's like a constant process of cultural exchange and transformation. Traditional and modern elements are in an ongoing dialogue, sometimes clashing, sometimes merging into something new. That's why even concepts like corruption or equality in Cambodia carry meanings that differ remarkably from Western definitions.
Absolutely. Speaking of corruption, the article really paints a vivid picture of how corruption in a Western sense is reinterpreted locally. Many see it almost as a normal extension of patron-client relationships, like a form of salary or gift, right?
Yes, precisely. The local understanding of corruption is fundamentally different because it's framed in terms of personal relationships and loyalty. So while aid groups and development workers might decry corruption as a failure of democratic ethics, Cambodians might view it as an extension of traditional social contracts.
Yeah, that's a great insight. But isn't there a tension there, though? I mean, doesn't that very acceptance of what Western observers call corruption undermine the overall promise of democracy?
Well, that's a point of contention. Some argue that it does. But then the article shows that this corruption is part of how the hybrid democracy operates. It's a double-edged sword. On one side, traditional power structures provide continuity and accountability through personal ties. On the other, they can hinder the kind of institutional accountability that liberal democracy prizes.
I can see that. It seems, then, that there's an inherent ambivalence in the democratic discourse in Cambodia. On the one hand, people value the idea of democracy with all its promises of rights and freedom, yet on the other, they are deeply tied to traditional modes of governance that emphasize personal loyalty and material exchange.
Yes, yeah. And the interviews reveal that many Cambodians are quite conflicted. For example, some say that democracy sounds confusing because the word was overused, even misused, during the Khmer Rouge period, so now it requires reinterpretation to resonate with local values.
Right. And that constant reinterpretation is part of what's so fascinating. I also liked how the article points out that the struggle over meaning, what democracy means, is essentially a discourse battle. Different political actors, NGOs, and even international bodies like the UN have tried to shape its definition.
Absolutely. It's not just a static definition, it's like a living process where power dynamics play a huge role. Remember Foucault's idea about who gets to define discourse? In Cambodia, the local actors are increasingly challenging the truth that was once imposed by international bodies.
That power shift is really significant. And that shift is tied up with the broader narrative of, social change in a post-conflict environment. The legacy of past regimes, whether the Khmer Rouge or communist practices, strongly influences how politics is conducted today.
Right, it's like, history continues to echo. These lingering pasts aren't easily dismissed. They morph into new forms of governance. Even when elections and voter registrations are implemented, the inherent cultural and historical baggage remains, influencing contemporary choices.
Yep, that's a very nuanced point. And then there's the challenge about gender. The article reveals how traditional gender roles also shape democratic practices. For instance, how women's participation is affected by the same historical and cultural forces.
Right. It's like the hybrid democracy framework isn't just about political institutions, but also about social identities and gender. Traditional views, for instance, see human rights as women's rights, which brings another layer of complexity to how democracy is lived and experienced.
Exactly. And then add in religious influences, monks, Wats, and the role of Buddhism, and you have this real melting pot of discourses. Some of these religious elements have blended with the democratic process, while others remain in conflict with it, like debates over whether monks should vote.
Yes, that tension is particularly interesting. In many cases, the presence of religious institutions during political rallies gives leaders additional legitimacy, yet the separation of religious roles in the political sphere remains a contentious issue. It really shows that the hybrid form isn't about pure assimilation, but active contestation.
Right. That dynamic struggle is what makes it all so unpredictable, yeah. It seems to me that this kind of democracy, as articulated in Cambodia, challenges the neat categories we often use in the West. It's not simply democratic or authoritarian, but somewhere in between.
Exactly. And that's where Diamond's classification of gray zone regimes comes in. A lot of these transitional states aren't clearly one thing or the other. They embody a mix of features, making them hybrid regimes. In Cambodia, traditional patronage networks, the legacies of conflict, and modern democratization efforts are all entangled.
Yes, indeed. And to add another layer, the methodology of gathering all these insights through decades of interviews and field trips really brings out how diverse the interpretations are. It's not just top-down. The voices range from local politicians to grassroots activists and development workers.
Right. The use of snowball sampling for interviews, for instance, allowed the researcher to capture a broad spectrum of views, which enriches our understanding of how democracy is interpreted on the ground.
That approach certainly lends more depth. But, I do wonder, isn't there a risk that by focusing too much on these local interpretations, we might lose sight of the larger structural issues or even the benefits that come with a more standardized liberal democratic process.
That's a fair challenge. However, the article seems to argue that understanding these nuances is precisely what helps us grasp why a one-size-fits-all approach to democracy promotion doesn't really work. Local cultures have unique trajectories, and imbuing liberal democracy with local characteristics is essential, not a weakness, but a necessary adaptation.
Yeah, I can see that point. So, in a way, this hybridity isn't just a compromise. It can also be seen as a creative reimagining. It's about negotiating between conflicting worlds, which might ultimately lead to a more contextually relevant form of governance.
Exactly. And that's the takeaway here. Democracy in Cambodia isn't simply a transplanted Western model, but a dynamic, constantly evolving system, shaped by history, local discourses, resistance, and reinterpretation. It, signifies understanding the past while navigating the present in a hybrid, sometimes messy, but undoubtedly fascinating process.
Yes, oh, definitely. And it makes us ask a really, important question. What does democracy really mean when you factor in cultures, histories, and local power structures? How do you hold on to democratic ideals while respecting and incorporating local identities?
Right. That's the essence of the discussion. The Cambodian example forces us to rethink those overarching notions. It illustrates that democracy isn't just about elections and laws, but a lived experience, deeply enmeshed with, local values and practices.
Exactly. It's a real-life laboratory for political adaptation. Overall, this exploration into Cambodia's hybrid democracy really challenges us to broaden our views on political transformation. It shows that political change is not linear, and that the interaction of old and new is a perpetual process.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, it's important to acknowledge that while the UN and the international community may have sought to implement a neat liberal democratic system, the reality is much more complex, with local discourses, resistance, and reinterpretations all playing crucial roles.
Indeed, Thanks for this in-depth chat. It really brings out how political science, cultural studies, and history intersect in the Cambodian case. Really, food for thought.
Yes, indeed. Thanks for joining this insightful discussion on how democracy evolves when traditional, local understandings mix with imposed models. Until next time, keep questioning and embracing complexity.